In a world where the rules had radically changed, an era of universal transformation in social classes began, and alien dungeons appeared randomly across the planet. Thousands of people chose martial professions, risked their lives, conquered dungeons, and fought monsters from other worlds. Thus, humanity gradually evolved, giving rise to what became known as the so-called New Humans. However, our protagonist, Martine, faced tremendous difficulties in surviving in this new reality. His cousin, with a mocking smile, insinuated that the hero had already been expelled from the family, but still held some hope of changing his luck by switching classes. He looked at him with disdain and claimed that it would be better for him to spend the rest of his days at the lowest social position. But Martine clung to hope, promising to pay back every humiliation many times over, if necessary. However, Carl, his cousin, only laughed derisively. To him, Martine was a pathetic, ongoing joke. Then, the young man lifted his leg, preparing to deliver the final blow, and sarcastically said that perhaps in the next life, the hero could keep dreaming. At that moment, a priestess stepped forward, silencing everyone with her imposing presence. She remembered that they were in a class change temple and couldn't allow any disturbance. Carl snorted with disgust but stepped back with an expression of disdain. Before leaving, he commented that Martine had simply been lucky that the priestess intervened to save his life. The young woman then approached Martine and extended her hand, asking if he was okay. The protagonist accepted the help and slowly got up. Soon after, more youths began arriving at the temple, quickly filling the place with people. Finally, the official ritual began. A rough order was heard amid the silence, indicating that everyone should line up. One by one, the participants awakened their abilities, and the results appeared in a sphere. Some received Class D soldier training, which for Martine indicated that a person's value was measured by their rank. The rarer the class, the greater the potential. Soon, Carl also stepped forward and, touching the sphere, revealed to have a rare class, Novice Hero of rank B-. The crowd was surprised and began to whisper, as obtaining a B rank in the first awakening was considered a huge achievement. The cousin, sarcastically, told Martine he would be fortunate if he at least awakened as a D-ranked peasant. The young man said nothing, aware that to take revenge, he needed to obtain a combat class at any cost. Finally, it was Martine's turn. He advanced toward the sphere and placed his hand on it. At that very moment, something strange happened. Part 2 of 19. The sphere began to tremble violently, and flashes of energy spread through the crystal as if an immense force were awakening from within. Martine's eyes widened in astonishment, feeling that something was wrong. A dark blue energy started emanating from the sphere, gradually quieting the commotion and mockery of the crowd. A wave of cold swept through the hall, but those present continued to laugh and mock, unaware of the danger of that awakening. At that moment, a voracious and dark dance of energy erupted from Martine's body, filling the entire room. The protagonist was lifted into the air, surrounded by a blinding blue light that pulsed with frightening power. Then, before everyone's astonished eyes, a message appeared on the screen announcing the activation of an SSS rank class, the Shadow Summoner. Shortly after, Martine began to slowly descend to the ground, completely transformed. Suddenly, a formidable spectral figure of the goddess emerged behind him, leaving those present breathless and unable to believe what they saw. The situation seemed almost incredible to them. The pressure of that power was so immense that the awakening sphere shattered into 1,000 pieces. The temple's abbot, confused, shouted amidst the chaos that all of this was impossible, since SSS rank was considered the highest level. However, the master approached Martine with a satisfied smile, congratulating him on awakening a hidden class, though warning that the cost of summoning such power was very high. He estimated that the hero's true strength might be barely at level D, and that summoner classes required considerable financial investment. Hearing this, Carl burst out laughing and claimed that the hero had actually awakened a trash class, and that an SSS rank in that category was the perfect fit for Martine. With a defiant gesture, he challenged him to a training fight so everyone could see the extent of his new class. The priestess tried to stop him, pointing out that it was a mockery. But the old man, with a firm expression, cut her off and declared that the matter was the responsibility of the Yang family. Meanwhile, Martin calmly raised his head and agreed, saying that since his cousin insisted, they had no choice but to proceed with a training duel. Karl burst into loud laughter and drew his sword, coldly launching himself with the intention of ending him. At that moment, a bony, skeletal hand suddenly emerged from the ground, halting Karl's attack abruptly. The man turned pale with fright and, in a trembling whisper, asked what that was. Suddenly, a gigantic spectral figure with eyes glowing with a sinister light appeared before him. Upon seeing it, Karl screamed in terror. The apparition terrified him completely. Martin simply whispered that he didn't even know what kind of talent he had awakened. Then, confidently, he waved his hand. From the vortex of energy, blue flames erupted, and from within it descended the silhouette of the goddess of death, Dark Night. Karl watched that figure with horror, trembling and shouting that it was impossible, that the hero was just an ineffective fool who couldn't summon such a creature. The goddess, with a cold smile on her lips, blinked one scarlet eye and whispered that there was too much unnecessary chatter. The invocation took effect immediately. Karl's eyes bulged impossibly, the veins on his face burst, and his vision turned blood red. Blood gushed from his mouth, and his body convulsed as his internal organs were destroyed instantly. In an instant, the proud Karl collapsed to the ground, dead. The crowd was paralyzed with horror, and a whisper spread through the hall. People spoke with disbelief about how quickly the young lord was slain. The elder claimed that a hero had dared to kill a man in the Temple of Class Change, but Martin responded that it was a fair fight. However, the elder refused to listen to explanations and began to spin a blinding solar energy around himself. He declared that if a member of the Yang family died there, he could not answer for it before his lineage, and therefore, he had to execute the culprit. The protagonist showed not the slightest sign of fear. A dark vortex of energy formed before him, ready to strike. But before impact, the Dark Knight stepped forward, her darkness colliding with the bright light of the elder. The goddess slightly frowned and whispered to Martin if he could also deal with that person. The hero replied that it was still too early to open a direct conflict, and a lesson to the enemy would suffice. The Dark Knight gently bowed her head in acceptance and began concentrating violet energy in her palm. At that moment, a skeleton warrior emerged from the shadows and immediately attacked the elder, wielding his swords. Martin calmly observed that what happened to Karl was not exactly like that. It turned out he possessed a passive skill for the warrior class, False Death. This effect allowed him to survive a fatal damage once. Even in that state, he continued to threaten Martin, proclaiming that he was useless and wouldn't dare to kill him. He also warned that if the hero touched him, all the elders of the Yang family would pursue him to the end. But Martin raised his leg and looked disdainfully at Karl, who was trying to crawl away on the ground. In a calm voice, he said that, in that case, let the elders come, and with a sharp kick, his leg struck him down. The kick broke the stone floor, and Karl's life finally extinguished. As a result, the hero gained 1,200 experience points and reached level 2. Some time later, Karl's body rested in a coffin surrounded by the elder Yangs. One of them bitterly expressed that the same worthless person who had been expelled from the family dared to kill Karl. The elder struck the coffin with his fist and shouted angrily that such an act could not be forgiven. However, he was not willing to give up yet. Then, he stated that he had already paid a considerable sum to hire a high priest from the temple to perform the resurrection ritual. He then turned to a man in long robes standing beside him and requested that he start the process. The high priest looked at him calmly and commented that it was not very difficult. Next, he began the ceremony. The man declared that he was capable of resurrecting any person who had died within the last 24 hours. Suddenly, his eyes widened in alarm, indicating that something was wrong. At that moment, Martin appeared in front of him and revealed that he had known in advance about the attempt to resurrect Karl, and thus prepared an emergency plan. Just then, a purple light emerged from the tombstone, illuminating the scene with an intense glow. The hero explained that it was a corpse explosion technique and, with a somewhat mocking tone, suggested to consider it a small gift. The elder's face, filled with horror, twisted with the blast. Without warning, a rumble shook the entire room and a wave of dark energy swept through the place, causing the coffin to vanish in a violet flash. Among the debris, one of the elders managed to stand up, with emptiness in his eyes, understanding that he had lost everything. Without wasting time, he demanded that Martin be declared a fugitive immediately, offering a reward of 10 million gold coins. Elsewhere, the trial cave was one of the oldest and most well-known sanctuaries in that world. The monsters inside were relatively weak, making this place perfect for beginners to practice and train. Inside, a group of adventurers fought a boss, a level 15 minotaur, whose health remained intact. Every step it took made the ground tremble, forcing the team to retreat constantly and wait for a good moment to attack. Meanwhile, Martin watched the scene with evident apathy, silently sighing and noticing that the monsters in this dungeon were too weak for his level. One of the group members saw him and commented that this useless guy was good for nothing and wondered why he had come here. Another adventurer suggested that Martin just wanted to steal the loot dropped, and that they could deal with him later. Part 5 of 19. The tension increased as the fight neared its end. The Minotaur let out a final roar and, with his health at 0, his massive body tumbled to the ground with a thunderous crash. The new hunters celebrated, relieved that the dungeon had been conquered. But almost immediately, the scene changed dramatically. The floor began to pulse strangely, and the earth shook violently. Pieces of rock fell from the ceiling, and suddenly, a swirling portal emerged from the ground, opening amidst a huge red magic mark that quickly spread throughout the room, trapping the group inside. Meanwhile, Martine remained in the shadows, calmly observing the situation. Suddenly, a deafening roar cut through the silence, and a giant monster, a chimera, emerged from the center of the magic circle. The adventurers fell silent, paralyzed by surprise, and one of them, fear in his eyes, asked what kind of creature it was. Then, another warrior explained that they were facing a legendary secret boss, the chimera, whose appearance was extremely rare, with a 1 in 10,000 chance. However, at that moment, something in Martine caught his attention. An interesting opponent had finally appeared. While the others, fearfully hiding behind him, trembled, he stepped forward, surrounded by a glow of blue energy that enveloped his body, ready for whatever was to come. Suddenly, a huge wave of flames burst from the chimera's mouth and swept through the cavern, destroying everything in its path. One of the adventurers was unlucky, and the flames engulfed him completely, burning him alive in the stunned silence of his comrades. The hunters fled in panic, dispersing in all directions, but amidst the chaos, Martine stood firm, right in front of the creature. The remaining fighters began to retreat desperately, aware that their strength was far inferior to that of the monster. The chimera roared again, directing its gaze toward the only one not fleeing, but the young hero showed no sign of fear. Instead, he calmly raised his hand and softly uttered a command, summoning the Black Cavalry. At that moment, a huge magic circle lit up beneath his feet, bathing the cavern in a bright light. From the swirling shadows, the figure of the Black Cavalry, the goddess of death, appeared in response to her master's call. Her gaze immediately fixed on the colossal monster, and she declared she would face that beast without hesitation. Without wasting time, the goddess spoke a single word: disappear. At that instant, a dark energy condensed into a swirling vortex that enveloped the chimera, blocking its escape routes. With a blinding strike, the goddess shattered the lord of the chimera in an instant. Everything happened in the blink of an eye. The creature that minutes before had paralyzed the entire squad now lay lifeless and in pieces. Martine remained still, silently observing. Several system notifications appeared before him. He had leveled up for the first time, received a legendary item, the chimera, and unlocked new abilities, including the dark element sphere and necromancy. His strength grew rapidly. Meanwhile, the surviving hunters hid behind broken rocks, trembling with fear and eyes filled with distrust towards the young man. Confirming the chimera's death, an exit portal opened within the cave. Without a word, the hunters hurried toward the light, eager to distance themselves as quickly as possible before Martine noticed them. They wanted to get far away from that man as soon as possible. However, the hero perceived every movement and thought. He calmly called out to them, and his words struck them like a blow, stopping them dead in their tracks. Without hesitation, Martine slowly turned around, smiling gravely, and commented that there was no rush to leave. The goddess, who couldn't tolerate disrespect, reminded him calmly of the insults those humans had previously directed at her. With a cruel smile, she asked if she should kill them. But Martine stopped the goddess, explaining that it wasn't necessary because they hadn't done any harm. One of the hunters, trembling, fell to her knees and bowed deeply before him, admitting that they had been blind and inconsiderate in their attitude. She sincerely thanked the hero for having spared their lives. Martine watched her silently for a moment, allowing his thoughts to deepen. A dark, predatory smile appeared on his face, revealing that mercy was not free, and that if they wanted to leave alive, they had to prove their sincerity. At that moment, the young woman realized that this sincerity would cost them far more than they imagined. In the end, Martine essentially stripped them of their possessions, leaving the dungeon with thousands of coins and potions, and leaving the hunter standing in his underwear. The hero also realized that his new ability, the Dark Element Sphere, was terrifyingly powerful, although it consumed a huge amount of stamina and mana. However, thanks to his passive ability that significantly reduced energy expenditure, this was no longer a major problem. After leaving the dungeon, the young man changed his appearance and headed to the commercial district. He stopped in front of a weapon shop and spent some time examining the displays behind the glass. Finally, he decided it was time to upgrade his equipment, so he entered calmly and was greeted by the shop owner. However, the hero ignored him and headed straight for the weapons hanging along the walls. He took one of the swords and began examining it carefully, while the merchant kept a close watch. Noticing his simple clothing, the merchant thought he was a poor boy wasting his time. The merchant's irritation gradually grew, but Martine remained unmoved, focused on inspecting the weapon. Then, he stopped in front of a staff called the Crown of Hades and asked about its price. The merchant proclaimed that it was a true treasure, valued at 2 million gold coins. Suddenly, a bright purple aura lit up around Martine's hand, and he inquired how much a similar object could cost. At that moment, the merchant was frozen in surprise. He stuttered, saying it was made of a legendary material that could fetch at least 2.5 million coins at auction. The man, completely bewildered, asked how it was possible for a man like Martine to possess such an item. Then, the merchant quickly bowed, began to apologize hurriedly, and admitted that this material was far more valuable than anything else in his store. He swiftly asked the hero to wait a moment and disappeared behind the door to the back room. Meanwhile, the merchant turned to his assistant in a low voice and whispered that that was exactly the man their family, the Yangs, was looking for. He then ordered his assistant to contact them immediately, adding that he himself would stay in the shop to hold that visitor back. Soon, Martine asked how much longer he would have to wait, to which the merchant replied that almost everything was ready and asked him to be patient a little longer. At that moment, Martine's gaze instantly grew colder, and he asked why the merchant was so nervous. Suddenly, a massive two-handed sword fell to the ground right beside him. A group of knights entered the shop, and their leader announced that the elite forces of the Class Change Temple were in front of Martine. He then claimed that the Yang family had hired them to eliminate the hero. In response, Martine released his aura, and before him appeared the Dark Knight, while the workshop was illuminated with blue flames. The hero noticed that the Class Change Temple seemed to be in collusion with the Yangs, which made him think that the whole matter resembled more a rat's nest. The goddess sensed that a small knight dared to show contempt for his master, so she summoned the skeleton warriors. They instantly rose and charged forward, quickly surrounding the fair-haired knight. However, he only slightly lowered his gaze, showing no disturbance whatsoever. With a furious motion of his sword, he activated his technique, allowing a flash of golden energy to pass through the skeletons. Their bones and blue flames were dispersed across the floor in seconds. So, the man let out a laugh and declared that his squad specialized in destroying the undead and demons. Then, his gaze suddenly fixed on the goddess, and he suggested that the hero had killed Carl precisely with the help of the Dark Knight through eye contact. The knight, proud, stated that all A-ranked Grey Knights were equipped with high-level weaponry called the Holy Heart. He then arrogantly added that even a level 60 boss posed no challenge for them. Without wasting time, he charged at Martin and proclaimed that his main support as a hero was no longer useful, and that all he could do now was accept death calmly. But Martin didn't move and replied that it wasn't him who should die, but the knights. At that moment, the Dark Knight behind him closed his eyes, and a divine energy began to rapidly concentrate around him. The blonde knight advanced with a mocking laugh, claiming they were immune to instant death. And at that moment, a giant eye surrounded by celestial lightning appeared in the sky. It was the supreme power of an SSS-ranked deity, the gaze of death. Under its influence, the Holy Heart shattered into pieces. The knight's confidence vanished instantly amid horror. The goddess's energy threw him backward, and blood started to flow from his mouth. He fell heavily onto the stone as Martin and the Dark Knight watched from a distance. The knight, in despair, whispered that it was impossible because he used equipment granting immunity to instant death. Martin approached and explained that this equipment was of rare rank, but with a mocking tone, he added that he shouldn't think that such equipment could resist a god's gaze. Seeing their leader lying on the ground, one of the knights panicked and shouted that they had killed him. Without giving them time to mourn, Martin began to concentrate mana in his palm. He declared that he no longer needed the Dark Knight because he was capable of facing all his enemies on his own. Saying this, he cast a spell, and a huge column of dark blue energy burst from his hand. Meanwhile, the knights and priests still alive quickly formed a defensive line. One of the priests cast a divine protection spell, and instantly a large golden barrier appeared in front of them, with everyone directing their energy into it. The knight shouted that his enemy's abilities required an insane amount of mana, which meant their reserves were probably nearly depleted. At that moment, the land of the desolate, shadowy terrain was struck with a roar by the sacred light of the barrier. The priest clung to hope that they would withstand the attack first and then counterattack, eliminating the enemy once his stamina was exhausted. However, Martin only let out a laugh, as all of this was just beginning for him, since his mana reserves were far greater than anyone could imagine. Suddenly, columns of blue energy erupted from the surrounding ground, enveloping Martin. The power of that attack was so colossal that it completely overshadowed the golden barrier, and in horror, the priest's eyes widened as he saw the sacred light protection begin to crack. The cracks spread rapidly, and in a fraction of a second, the golden barrier shattered into 1,000 pieces. The knights shouted that it was impossible to defeat that monster and that they had to flee, but it was already too late. Soon after, a massive explosion shook the entire hall, and when it was over, the knights lay lifeless across the floor, while Martin remained amidst the devastation. At that very moment, the system raised his level to 22 and unlocked a new skill for the hero. The store owner realized, horror-stricken, that in front of him was a creature that had, in a single instant, annihilated an entire elite order of knights. As he understood that he was the only survivor, he quickly got to his feet, knowing that his life depended on escape. He began to run toward the exit, but before taking a step, the hero asked him where he thought he was going, as he still hadn't paid. His legs immediately faltered, and he fell to his knees, desperately begging for mercy. With trembling hands, the merchant extended his staff and pleaded for the object to be accepted at no cost, as long as his life was spared. It turned out that Hades' scepter was of epic rank, which significantly increased attack, mana, and defense, as well as greatly boosting dark energy damage. The hero warned that although the item was valuable, it was not enough to let him go just like that. Then, the merchant revealed that he had previously studied the scepter and discovered it was part of a complete Hades set. According to legend, whoever managed to gather the full set would gain true power, allowing them to control life and death itself. The merchant begged to be released, claiming he had revealed everything he knew and no longer wanted the materials he had purchased, even willing to return every last item. However, the protagonist demanded guarantees. The creature of darkness helped him and bound him with an oath of the Styx River. At that moment, invisible waves traversed the air, marking the beginning of a new chapter in that dark and terrible story. The dark waters began to rise silently from the ground, slowly enveloping the merchant's legs. Suddenly, bony hands appeared from the depths and gripped the merchant tightly, gradually dragging him into the darkness. The hero observed that he had no intention of ending his life, but instead demanded that he swear, before the river's stigmas, that he would reveal nothing about his confrontation with the knights. Nervously, the shopkeeper nodded vehemently and promised to keep silent about what had happened. After that, the knight performed the ritual, and the goddess confirmed the validity of the oath, warning that anyone who broke it would be dragged to the bottom of the river for eternity. Following this declaration, the ghostly waters dissipated, and Martin headed for the exit, aware that his paths would diverge there. Sitting alone in the shop in silence, the merchant muttered that this time, he truly had lost big. However, he tried to convince himself that it had all been just an illusion, a trick, and that the story of the river Stygias was only a deception. Meanwhile, the scene shifts to the opulent residence of the Yang family. Suddenly, a loud thump on the wooden table echoed throughout the room, breaking the silence with a thunderous sound. Evan, the second young master of the Yangs, overheard his subordinates meeting and exclaimed in disbelief. He was informed that the 12th Squadron of Knights, an elite force from the Change of Classes Temple, had been completely destroyed. Evan, surprised, wanted to understand how something like that could have happened, given that this force was part of the Power Sanctuary. The informant explained that all the knights had been wiped out inside the smithy, and added that they had already brought the owner of the establishment before him. Soon, he entered the room, bowing respectfully and smiling nervously as he greeted his young lord. Evan wasted no time and demanded to know all the details, promising a reward to anyone who could explain how Martin had managed to destroy that squadron of knights. Enticed by the promise of wealth, the merchant gathered his courage, letting greed overrun his oath. He began to recount everything in detail, about to mention that Martin had invoked something during the fight when suddenly, the ground beneath his feet started to quiver, transforming into a dark whirlpool. Evan watched in horror as a terrifying force arose in the heart of the mansion. In the middle of the room, a gigantic whirlpool of black water opened up, and the merchant screamed in pain as the waves consumed him completely. At that moment, bony hands emerged from the whirlpool, grabbing his boots and slowly dragging him into the depths. His desperate cry for help was in vain, and he was soon swallowed by the dark waters, trying to justify his betrayal of the oath, claiming he never intended to break it. But Martin, calm, declared that anyone who violated his oath would be condemned to be dragged to the bottom of the river, a fate he himself had set for anyone who betrayed trust. Suddenly, a space crack resembling a portal opened nearby, from which countless skeletons began to emerge. Evan's expression changed upon seeing these creatures, and slowly, one after another, the skeletons headed toward him. The boy quickly looked around and found a bow with arrows behind him. Without hesitation, he took the weapon and, irritated, thought that he had no idea where these creatures came from or how Martin had managed to send them there. Without further ado, he began shooting arrows at the advancing skeletons. However, the number of enemies was overwhelming, and it became increasingly difficult to stop their progress. At that moment, a powerful spell descended from the sky, instantly destroying the skeletons completely. Evan's rescuer was a young woman who suddenly appeared close to him. Without beating around the bush, she reproached him for his helplessness in unable to face a group of undead. Then she explained that those doors, which had suddenly opened, were only a temporary passage to the Styx River, which would close shortly. Just after saying this, a whirlpool began to dissipate rapidly. Evan stood for a moment watching the disappearing door, until finally, he breathed a sigh of relief. He placed a hand on the young woman's shoulder and suggested that she think about marrying him, as he was clearly worthy of such a union. However, she immediately pulled her hand away. She reminded him that although the class-changing temple collaborated with the Yang family, that did not give him the right to behave so arrogantly. Evan responded that after eliminating Martin, who had ruined his reputation, the elders of the temple would support their union. The scene then shifted to a desolate place. The Dead Desert, a zone of extreme danger. Innumerable demonic beasts dwelled there. So few adventurers dared to venture into its borders. It was also the home of a level 65 monster, Anubis, the god of death. At that moment, the ruler was furious, for someone dared to disturb his rest. In front of him stood the Dark Knight, surrounded by an army of skeletons. Without wasting time, Anubis summoned his own army of kobolds, which quickly launched into battle against the skeletons. Martin observed that, as he expected, Hades' team's power was impressive, but the quality of their soldiers was even greater. Immediately, he activated a necromantic control-enhanced skill that further increased the strength of his skeletons. The fight was swift and decisive. The skeletons subdued the kobolds and completely exterminated the monster's forces. Anubis's fury grew as he watched his army being destroyed so easily. However, he warned his opponent not to become arrogant. Then he summoned a magic staff in his hand and declared that he would face the battle seriously. First, Anubis took out the divine scales and placed the protagonist's heart on one side, while a feather rested on the other. At that moment, an unbearable pain struck Martin's chest, as if something was pressing forcefully on his heart. Unable to prevent it, the hero knelt down, clutching his chest in distress. Anubis declared that now the enemy's heart was under his control, and that if the scales tilted even slightly, it meant his sins outweighed a feather, which would result in a death sentence. When this condition was met, the god of death immediately pronounced the verdict. However, suddenly, a tremendous explosion occurred, and the hero screamed, grasping his chest in despair. But in the very next instant, he rose with determination, and the pain disappeared, giving way to a sneering smile on his face. He then claimed it had all been a joke, which left Anubis momentarily paralyzed with surprise. Martin stated that he was the true master of darkness and death, and that no instant death could harm him. Upon hearing this, the god exclaimed that such a thing was impossible, for there was only a man before him. Yet deep down, a shadow of fear began to invade him, as the dark aura of the young man seemed utterly inhuman. Without giving him time to react, the protagonist ordered the goddess to end the fight. Obeying, she stepped forward and began to channel dark energy into her palm. When Anubis realized that his end was inevitable, genuine fear overtook him, though there was no time left to escape. Next, the Knight of Darkness launched his attack, forming a dark vortex resembling a black hole that swallowed the god of death in an instant. He cried out as his body disintegrated, turning into ashes in a short time. Upon dying, his collar fell to the ground, and the hero gained approximately 64,000 experience points, reaching level 35. Then, Martin picked up the fallen object, which turned out to be a Hades medallion, whose power was astounding. It also granted immunity to several negative conditions. The hero decided to keep the collar and prepared to leave, aware that he now possessed the second piece of Hades' equipment. However, suddenly, a voice spoke behind him, asking him to stop. Turning around, he saw Anubis in surprise. The god of death admitted that the enemy's strength had exceeded his expectations and announced that he had decided to acknowledge his power. Then he stepped forward and knelt, saying that if the hero deemed him worthy, he was willing to serve him. The Knight of Darkness was completely stunned. After accepting Anubis, Martin sealed him inside the medallion, feeling an immense satisfaction with the outcome. The hero did not expect such a good reward. He had not only gained great experience and an epic item, but also a powerful strategic ally. Then he opened a black portal and left the dungeon, thinking that he still needed to gather the other 3 pieces of the equipment he was searching for. Only then would he be able to face the Yang family. However, suddenly 2 arrows soared through the sky and headed straight for him. The first one hit its target precisely, causing a devastating explosion. The ones who had prepared the ambush turned out to be Evan and Patricia. The man, feigning satisfaction, announced that he had finally caught the main character. But Patricia, with cold indifference, warned him that it was still premature to celebrate, as first they needed to make sure the enemy was truly dead. Then Evan looked toward the clouds of smoke. At that moment, the protagonist emerged unscathed from among the fumes. In a distant tone, the hero commented that Evan hid in the shadows and shot from the clandestine, calling him with contempt, "Trash." Right at that moment, Dark Knight appeared beside him, and he noticed with surprise that the Yang family was sending their new prey, showing an apparently irrational generosity. Seeing the goddess, Evan froze, thinking that he was facing a divine creature of legendary fame. Conversely, Patricia remained perfectly still, as if her soul had been frozen. The young woman took a special object from her belongings, a celestial stone, with the certainty that they also had an ace up their sleeve, the summoning of the cherubs. She activated the stone, and in an instant, a cherub appeared behind her, radiating a luminous aura. Patricia proudly claimed that she possessed 3 celestial stones, and added that the cherub was a high-ranking archangel, whose fighting strength matched, or even surpassed, that of gods, reaching levels above 70. Seeing the celestial creature, Martin looked at the goddess and asked if the girl could defeat him without resorting to instant death. Dark Knight replied that the fight would be difficult, but her opponent was not yet her rival. Then, confidently, she declared that she would end the battle in just 3 minutes. Following this, the warrior advanced toward the archangel and began the fight with determination. Meanwhile, Evan tightened his bow again, aiming an arrow at the protagonist. He was convinced that, at this moment, no one could protect him. Therefore, he called Patricia to help him eliminate that bastard, and the young woman quickly moved to surround the hero from another direction. However, a luminous circle appeared on the ground, and a deep voice declared that his enemies had overestimated themselves by thinking they only had one god on their side. Then he summoned a new servant, the god of death, Anubis. With a formidable presence, the figure of the god began to rise slowly from the summoning circle, shrouded in dark and powerful energy. It was clear that Evan was now facing another god, which left him completely stunned. Overwhelmed by disbelief and despair, he exclaimed that this couldn't be true. Without wasting a moment, Evan fired an arrow directly at Anubis. The arrow sliced through the air and sped straight ahead, but at that very instant, a loud metallic cracking sound was heard. An arrow hit an invisible barrier and disintegrated instantly, revealing a transparent protective shield around Anubis. The god turned respectfully towards Martine and observed that since being summoned by him, his powers had increased significantly. However, the hero interrupted him, telling him to stop flattering him, and then ordered the elimination of Evan. Meanwhile, Anubis bowed his head in respect and raised his divine scales. This time, the test would be against Evan himself. As soon as the scales appeared, the man clutched his chest, feeling an unbearable pain piercing through his heart. Anubis announced that his spirit would be weighed, reminding him that Evan had spent his life intimidating the weak and committing countless atrocities. The scale with his heart quickly dropped, and the god of death declared that for someone like him, only one end could exist: death. At that moment, Evan's heart burst inside his chest, and a sudden flow of blood gushed from his mouth. Patricia watched without the least emotion, as Evan's death did not provoke any reaction in her. Even on his deathbed, Evan refused to accept that his life would end this way, although he was completely losing his grip on life at that moment. The protagonist approached Patricia and noticed that Evan had already died, but she remained completely calm. The young woman replied indifferently that Evan was merely a weakling, so his death did not evoke any feelings in her. Then, she drew her staff and confidently stated that the battle should have been over by then. Patricia added that the false god Martine had summoned would not be able to withstand the archangels, confident in Cherubim's victory. However, at that very moment, a powerful explosion was heard in the distance, and her expression changed drastically. Fixing her sight on the source of the noise, she saw the goddess standing impassively over the body of the fallen angel. The Dark Knight commented indifferently that his enemy was even weaker than he had assumed. At that moment, the protagonist appeared behind Patricia with a faint smile and reminded her of her previous words. The young woman was surprised to see that her second-ranked angel had already been defeated. He watched as the huge body of cherubim slowly disintegrated into particles of light and completely disappeared. Meanwhile, the protagonist looked at her calmly and asked if she still truly considered herself his enemy. Then he offered her a single chance. Surrender. She had to yield at that moment. Patricia understood that she was facing a truly dangerous enemy, a monster she could not defeat, so she decided to pretend to submit and secretly plan an escape. She claimed to be ready to give up, while secretly devising a strategy. She did not trust Patricia and suggested resolving the situation differently, but Martin remained calm and declared that it was not the time to hurry. Then he raised his hand and began to summon darkness, preparing his next move. At that moment, dozens of bony hands emerged from the ground with incredible force. After this, Martin looked at Patricia and said he would not trust her so easily. However, there was only one way to prove true loyalty. Then the hero ordered her to swear, before the souls of the Styx River, that she fully accepted his authority and would be his faithful maiden. Patricia tried to oppose, arguing that this was too much, as she was a priestess in a temple dedicated to a changing god. Her voice trembled clearly, aware that this irreversible promise left her trapped with no escape. Upon hearing this, Martin's gaze turned cold. Calmly, he warned that if she was not satisfied, he could send her to the waters of the Styx River immediately. Suddenly, Patricia's staff fell from her hands and struck the ground. She fell to her knees, understanding that there was no way out. Finally, she swore that, as a priestess of the Temple of the Changing God, before the souls of the Styx River, she promised to serve Martin and be faithful to him for all eternity. At that moment, the oath was sealed, and her fate fully passed into the hands of the protagonist. Soon after, the spirit of Evan appeared before them. Seeing what was happening, Evan began to shout furiously, hurling curses at Patricia and demanding that she avenge him. Martin declared that that was precisely why he had kept his soul, to witness his defeat. The spirit's face twisted with rage, but his scream was interrupted when an invisible force snatched his soul, which vanished into the abyss. Martin, with an indifferent expression, commented that his usefulness had ended, as his destiny had already been sealed. Then he turned back to Patricia, who remained kneeling, her forehead pressed to the ground. Martin approached and silently pondered how he should proceed next. Meanwhile, Patricia imagined the worst possible ways he could punish her. But suddenly, her thoughts were interrupted. The protagonist looked at her and reminded her that he had already taken that oath before the spirits of the Styx River, so there was no reason to be so nervous. Upon hearing this, Patricia lowered her gaze, and her cheeks blushed slightly. On the other hand, Martin asked why the Temple of the Changing God had been working so closely with the Yang family recently. Patricia honestly replied that the reason was related to Sean, the hero's elder brother, who was about to undergo his third-class change. Hearing this, the protagonist showed genuine interest and asked exactly when Sean was going to change his category. Patricia hesitated for a moment before answering. Meanwhile, the story shifted to the western branch of the Class Change Temple, a building protected by a powerful energy barrier. In the center of the hall, an elderly man with gray hair declared that this day would be an important moment for the temple. Next to him was Sean, a level 60 warrior, holder of a double A-rank classification, and a Knight of the Holy Light. The young man listened to the murmurs of the guests with a smug smile. Many had mentioned that the Emperor Paladin class was legendary, nearly invincible among combatants of his level. Hearing these words, Sean just smiled even wider. Suddenly, Rose, president of the 7-Star Chamber of Commerce, commented that conducting such an important ceremony in such a public place was very risky. She noted that the Yang family had accumulated many enemies and that recently a wanted criminal had appeared nearby. However, Sean reassured her, affirming that everything was protected with divine arts at the West Branch. No one would dare challenge that barrier, and anyone attempting to breach it would face death. At that very moment, a powerful explosion was heard right above the protective habitat, causing the entire building to shake and making the attendees sway, while a chilling cold spread through the hall. Rose looked up and felt a shiver run down her spine. Shortly after, a second explosion echoed and a cloud of black smoke began to spread across the ceiling. The old man's face immediately darkened, as he perceived a familiar aura and understood that it was undead energy. Instantly, the black mist dissipated, and from the center, the main figure emerged calmly. Then, Martin looked directly at him and announced that this day was crucial for his class change, which was why he had come with his younger brother to congratulate him, although his voice betrayed a bitter mockery. The old man and Sean were surprised, but even more so by the appearance of the hero. Patricia was standing behind, silent, clearly uncomfortable with her new appearance. Upon seeing this, the old man's face distorted with anger, demanding loudly to know what the protagonist had done to his Holy One. Sean, for his part, clenched his fists in fury, his eyes shining with contained rage. However, Martin took Patricia by the chin and declared that she was no longer a saint, but his lover. The girl hesitated for a moment and then confirmed that this was indeed the case. At that instant, everyone in the room froze, stunned, unsure of how to react. Rose, looking at Martin, suspected that he was the same traitor from the Yang family, responsible for so much confusion. The crowd could not believe someone would dare treat a temple saint with such disdain, and they thought that this act might cost him his life. Immediately, the temple guardians arrived, and their leader ordered the immediate execution of the scoundrel who had disturbed the temple's peace. At that moment, the skeletons summoned by Martin revealed sinister gleams in their eyes. Before the priests could react, the skeleton warriors lunged at them and eliminated their leader in an instant. Sean quickly reacted, reaching for his weapon to end Martin, who had dared to destroy his barrier and unleash chaos there. However, the elder stopped him, saying that Sean's promotion to a higher class was more important and that he himself would keep Martin under control. The hero then addressed everyone present and declared that his main goal was Sean and the Temple of Awakening. He asked them simply to step back and watch, assuring them that he would not harm innocent people. Nevertheless, the elder was not willing to give up. Although he acknowledged that Martin had managed to capture St. Patricia, despite his lesser strength, he was prepared to risk his life. Therefore, he used the Great Seal, an 8th-level divine technique, to enclose Martin in a cage. The hero looked around soberly, not understanding where he had been placed. It turned out that the elder was trying to seal Martin. Those present remembered that this seal had previously been used to trap a divine-level boss. The elder explained that this seal was linked to his vital energy and was powered by hundreds of high-level divine arts from the temple. He assured that breaking it would be as difficult as destroying an entire continent. However, to everyone's horror, at that moment the seal shattered into pieces. The protagonist emerged unscathed, unharmed. The elder fell to his knees, coughing blood, utterly bewildered at how Martin had managed to break the barrier. The hero, with an indifferent attitude, approached and asked him to repeat his statement about the impossibility of breaking that seal. Martin, smiling, claimed he did not quite understand what the elder was talking about. The old man's reply was a furious glare, refusing to accept the young man's provocations. At that moment, an explosion erupted behind Martin, and a massive column of fire descended into the temple, drawing everyone's attention. It turned out to be Sean, who during that stage had successfully advanced to the SS level, known as the Holy Emperor Paladin. In an instant, Sean extended his arms, and divine wings emerged from his back. Before the protagonist stood now a Holy Emperor Paladin of level 60. He looked at his opponent with contempt, understanding that he was no longer his equal. Rose was paralyzed with horror on her face, and everyone present understood that Sean had indeed been blessed, as the rumors circulated. Rose knew that leveling up to a higher rank was extremely difficult, with a success rate of less than 1%. At that moment, Sean drew his sword and took a step forward. Everyone held their breath, watching him approach Martin. However, the hero did not attempt to attack him. Instead, he began to applaud his older brother. He congratulated him calmly on his successful promotion, even though Martin didn't expect him to succeed. Sean did not respond. He simply walked past him and approached the old man, his master, apologizing for the delay. The old man hurried to assure him that everything was fine. He was still breathing, which indicated that the young man was not too late. Then he cast a furious glance at the protagonist and declared that they should first deal with him. However, Martin immediately sent his skeletons to attack, asserting that they could still see who would truly prevail. Sean hesitated for a moment, then immediately cut the undead warriors in half with his sword, declaring that ordinary zombies were not worth his time or effort. Realizing that his brother possessed an S-class combat ability, mastery of imperial power, the tension in his eyes significantly increased. The others, as expected, rejoiced greatly upon seeing Sean appear, and the uncomfortable chill that had tormented them disappeared instantly. Their bodies filled with energy, renewed and strong. Then Sean directed his sword at the protagonist and ordered him to summon his deity, assuring that, in this circumstance, the battle would be perfectly balanced. Martin, with a smile, only warned him not to blame him for what he had requested. After that, the hero made a gesture with his hand and summoned his subordinate, the dark goddess, the Black Knight. The young woman immediately appeared, smiling at everyone. However, Sean, who was immune to all negative effects, indicated that Martin should rely solely on his brute strength. Suddenly, he knelt abruptly, and a blood pool burst from his mouth. The hero let out a laugh, saying that Sean acted with such confidence despite not possessing divine immunity against instant death. Martin, with a mocking smile, asked if he truly believed he was the absolute protagonist of the story.